Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today's video is an album review on Surgeon's 10th album called Shellwave, which comes out on May 2nd, 2025 on Tresor Records. I'm happy to get a chance to preview this album before it comes out. Um, I've been a I've been a fan of Surgeon's for a long time. I first got he's been doing music for about 30 years. His real name is Anthony Child, and he's from the UK, and he's been doing techno since probably about 93 or 94, somewhere in that time. I think his first release was in 95, so this could be about 30 years this year for him producing techno music. The first track I ever heard from Surgeon was on a mix back in 1996 and the track was called Atoll, and it was on his first album here called Communications. And I could tell from that track that it was unique in a way, and I think at the time there was a lot of warehouse techno. It was kind of sort of maybe the end of, in some ways, maybe it might be the end of the sort of warehouse rave days around 95, but still in America, it was still going on pretty strong in 95. And I kind of considered Surgeon's music like sort of like the epitome of sort of warehouse rave music. It was like, kind of the repetitive, um, strong techno, aggressive, dangerous, sweaty warehouse type of techno where it was just relentless, but it wasn't relentless to the point where it wasn't intricate, and it wasn't, in some ways, had a sort of an, I wouldn't say mechanical, but maybe it was sort of industrial influence. So it definitely caught an ear with me because, I've been a big fan of industrial music since the middle '80s, and so I could tell in his production that, or I felt like I could tell in his production that he was a little bit different. And started following his career right away after I got Communications, and then of course, it kind of made sense. He went to Tresor Records, and um, he released these three EPs, three albums in succession. Uh, was the function and force and form, and then also balance, and then basic tonal vocabulary. It's funny how sometimes you just can't remember names of albums. In some ways, you almost remember them more by the graphics. But those albums came out, and then he started his own label called Dynamic Tension in 2000, roughly. Well, actually, probably a few years earlier than that with his first with some EPs, but um, he did four albums on the Dynamic Tension label, and then he came back to Tresor in 2023 to release his ninth album, and then here we have Shellwave, his 10th album. But all in all, he probably has over 30 or 40 EPs as well, and he's definitely considered one of the, I would say one of the most, I wouldn't say most important techno producers, but definitely one of the leading techno producers when it comes to rhythmic techno, especially back in probably the pinnacle of harder techno. Maybe in like '97 to like 2004. He was kind of probably one of the leading names, along with like Jeff Mills and some other producers. He was also one of the first techno producers I saw that was really involved in modular, uh, making techno on modulars, as far as like live. I remember like a video back in like 2006 or 2007 of him doing a live gig where he was using modulars and patching cables and doing it that way. And that was, in some ways, that was very groundbreaking. It was definitely a few years before before the modular synth craze and I Dream of Wires DVD documentary, which I think was 2012, 2013, if I'm not mistaken. But that sort of modular synthesis started getting popular in like 2010 to 2014. But he was one of the earlier ones that was kind of still um, still using that, and then also not only doing that, but then doing it live. Like he was one of the first that I knew in the middle 2000s that started doing that. So he's definitely been a groundbreaking producer in some ways, leading techno producer in some ways as well. But I've always really enjoyed his intricacy when he makes techno, and he seems to kind of harness the idea of warehouse techno still, and he still keeps it more aggressive, more again more dangerous, more. Jeff Mills once said that techno necessarily isn't, well, not in so many words. But he said techno is not really a style of music that you dance to. It's more of music that's for your head. And Surgeon was one of the first producers around 95, 96, 97, along with some other names that where I really got into techno really hard in a more in depth way because it more suited towards my uh, my desires of what I wanted techno to sort of go towards, and that was more of a listening techno and not so much of a rave techno, and that sort of evolved in the middle '90s to where a lot of these producers had more of an outlet as techno got popular. They could actually make albums and full releases and really kind of make studio albums more so than club EPs. And that was a big change for techno, in my opinion. And that's something that's really carried on today, where it kind of, it's kind of mainstay now. But techno producers making a full album in the middle '90s was still fairly new. And the Surgeon's, has been pretty consistent through his career with not following any trends and not following any particular styles. He's certainly kind of keeping doing his own thing, and you got to hand it to him. Definitely through some of the lean years of techno of like 2005 to 2010 specifically, or even 2003 to 2010 specifically. Like techno was on the pretty much on the way out. Like you did not hear a lot of faster techno. Especially this is before like Bergheim Club and Bergenheim and the techno resurgence that sort of happened around 2010, 2012 period with all a new generation of producers. But Surgeon stayed consistent through all that and stayed true to what he's done. And so him and along with a handful of other producers that I still followed, I still have the utmost respect for, and I still follow people like Johannes Heel and um, Heiko Lau and James Ruskin and producers like that still make consistent techno music and stayed true to their roots and stayed true to what they felt like techno should be. And it's funny how trends kind of come and go, but in some ways, like they were right. Especially when I hear a lot of the new techno today, which is kind of slower and I guess just differently produced. A new wave of producers will do that, but there's something special about techno like Surgeon makes, and especially if you kind of went through the '90s and sort of hear the evolution of techno. There's a lot of techno that I like these days. Don't get me wrong, but it is kind of cool hearing somebody who's been around for 30 plus years and is still kind of coming out and making an album and doing it how they want to. So I fully respect that. So I'm really curious to check out the new album. It's called Shellwave. Again, it's his 10th album, his fifth on Trezor, and it'll be out in May. So we're gonna take a listen to each track. You'll see my score on the video, on the clip of each track, and then I'll give you my overall thoughts at the end of the video. So there we got a chance to check out a sample of each track on Shellwave, the new album by Surgeon, which comes out on May 2nd, 2025 on Trezor Records. Um, the great thing about Surgeon's music is he does a great job of building rhythms and evolving the sounds and the rhythms within the track, and just does a great job of the flow of tracks. To me, he doesn't seem like an artist that produces techno in blocks, like with sound effects. And he definitely creates tracks that flow and ebb and flow. And it's great how the sounds kind of rise and then they go to like some depths. And I kind of consider Surgeon a more of a linear techno producer in that respect, and not somebody who necessarily builds tracks for the club or builds tracks for piece by piece. He seems like he really kind of gets into the rhythms and wants the tracks to flow in a more natural way. And I kind of almost think of that in more of a song based style of the ebbs and flows of making a song, which is kind of old school when you think about it. And it's strange to think about that now, but you have a lot of electronic producers who are really kind of piecing in sounds, and they're like, "Oh, I like the sound. Let's put the sound here. Let's put the sound here." And it seems like they kind of uh, piece make their tracks, and there's good things about that because the sounds themselves sound great a lot of times, but then it doesn't necessarily work so well in the rhythm. And with Surgeon, you have the total opposite of that, in my opinion. Like everything flows so well and comes and goes and builds, and it becomes almost subliminal in the tracks. Like when I think of like track number 7, Triple Threat. At first, I wasn't sure if I really kind of liked it. It was kind of one of the ones that I thought, as I first heard it, I was like, well, it's good, but then it grew on me, and it becomes a grower, and it's a track that the rhythm eventually gets you. I find the main sound in that not really necessarily too abrasive or unpleasant, but it's not like like super pleasant either. But that's techno. Sometimes there's sounds in there which can be a little abrasive and a little aggressive, and dangerous, and that's the idea of techno. But that sound didn't necessarily wow me in any way. I mean, I think it's well done, but it doesn't. The tone of it doesn't really jive with me fully. But and it goes through pretty much the whole track in a lot of ways. I mean, it's flowing, but the rhythm is so intricate and so addictive that you can sort of tune out that. And that's the great thing about techno is it's deeper listening where you can focus in on certain rhythms, certain sounds, and just totally get lost in them and forget about what you may or may not like, but the rhythm is going to get you. Who said that? Yeah, Gloria Estefan, Miami Sound Machine. But it's true. It's the rhythm gets you. It's so tribal and great hearing great tribal techno like this. And it when I got to track 2, for example, Soulfire, it's actually my least liked song on the album. Strangely enough, I gave it 5.5 stars. I think it's a pretty good album, pretty good track. But I love that Surgeon is introducing some African tones in here, some African sounds in there. It's kind of got some steel drums in there and some Congolese kind of percussion and metallic and aggressive. And I really think it's cool that he's added some of those sounds in there. You might be wondering why I have some African art next to me, and Soulfire kind of inspired me to kind of bring those out because it's my grandparents were missionaries in Africa in the late 40s, 50s, and some of the 60s. And so my father, he spent his early life in Africa in the Belgian Congo in 1948 roughly to 1962. So he spent from when he was about 2 or 3 years old all the way till he was about I think 12 or 13. And so I have a lot of African art, and it's very important for me, and what I grew up around, like you know just being involved in and really being inspired by African art. And here's a example of a wooden warrior, carved out of wood. I think this is kind of like a driftwood. This is kind of lighter. But then I also have this one, which is definitely heavier, and it's kind of made from a heavier tree. I'm not sure what tree it is, but obviously this guy's playing drum, you know, but he has a really cool look on him. But I love African art. Here's a couple of ivory ones that were carved that my parents brought back. And these were ones made from, my parents didn't buy these from a store. They lived with a tribe because my grandfather was not only um, they were missionaries, but he was also a doctor and helped build a hospital in Congo. I wish I knew the name of it. My family knows the name of it, but my father passed away last year, and he had some great stories of growing up in Belgium, Congo. And so, like I've kind of grown up through like tribal sounds and tribal music in a lot of ways. And there's a band called Kanono Number One that started in like the mid '90s, and they had a couple albums in the later 2000s. And it's kind of the Congolese music. And what they would do was they would take these metal instruments as and they have sounds, and they would make them out of turtle shells, and they would make them out of all kinds of instruments. If you ever seen, there's some great videos on YouTube, but they're kind of metallic thimbles, and they make sound out of them. And as electricity came into it, they were able to tie them to electric sound systems and speaker systems, and it's almost like a African version of Jamaica and their sound systems, and sort of creating these stacks of speakers, and hooking them up to the light pole and getting power, and the generators and stuff like that, and having a party and playing music, and in that way kind of Congo did that with these metallic instruments and different things that made sounds, and they eventually would connect them to um, speaker systems and play them very loudly. And Kanono Number One was a group of artists that sort of came to I wouldn't say the limelight, but they got fairly popular on the underground with their style of music, and kind of showing the Western world probably what kind of traditional but also futuristic rhythm. But if you heard the actual songs, they sound very techno, and they're very very cool. So um, not to go off on a tangent, but Soulfire track number two reminds me of that. And if you wanted to check out like the history of like um, African music and stuff, there's some great videos on YouTube about Congolese tribal music, and definitely check out Kanono Number One. You'll be If you're into rhythmic techno and you want to check out some really tribal rhythms and stuff like that. Just a great sound and a great lineage of music from that country and Africa in general. It's just great hearing a more organic techno in many respects, and to know that it's actually a part of their history and a part of their culture and stuff like that. It's just fantastic, because you think of like rhythmic music as being something that's new, but it's been going on for obviously thousands of years, and making drums and things like that. And that's why you have something like this, like an artist would make that. Music is such an integral part of African culture, and it's that's another great thing about techno in general, is it's kind of carrying on that lineage in a different way. And that's what's great about Surgeon doing that track. I felt like in a way he kind of honored African uh, tribal music with that track, and kind of brought it into his sound. So to be honest with you, when I heard the first two tracks, I was they sounded very Surgeon to me, and but I felt like those two tracks are a little bit more his maybe older style. It sort of reminded me of his later '90s stuff. And so I wasn't necessarily like blown away at all, but solid stuff. I gave the first track 6.5 stars. I gave the second track 5.5 stars. Good and pretty good tracks. But then when I heard track number three, it really kind of made the album take off. Divine Shadow, track number three, is just sick. I gave it 8 stars out of 10. Um, just it reminds me of, I don't know if you can hear it. You hear it on the sample, or you want to check it out again. But I don't know about you, but it sounds like Bass Cad by Autek. You know the track, if you know it from from their 1993 album. Those metallic kind of drum kind of sounds like, it sounds like Bass Cad, but the rhythm is so dope. Oh, it's so sick. And then it goes right into Forgotten Gods, which is even better. I gave it 8 3/4 stars. If Forgotten Gods had a little bit of a melody on it, I would probably put it in the 9. I love the deep groove on it. So tribal, so analog. This track could go on for hours. I wouldn't care a bit. It's such a sick groove. Man, that track's tough. And then track number 5 is called Dying, which is kind of a short interlude. It kind of breaks up the two halves of the album, in my opinion. But it has really cool sound on it. I gave it 7 stars. And then you have Infinite Eye. This is what I like about Surgeon that's so good. Like, this track just sneaks up on you, and it's, at the end of the track I was like, man, this track is nasty. This track is sick. Like, it was crazy because I was like, at first I was like, oh, this is cool. And then these just rhythms just consistently come out, and at the end of it, I was just like, wow, this is sick. And he does that so well. Triple Threat was solid. Kind of grew on me, like I was saying earlier. I gave it 6 3/4 stars. Solid track too. Empty Cloud, man, the beat really comes at you right at the beginning. It's probably one of the most pounding beats. And when I first heard it, I sort of thought it was more towards it kind of reminded me of loopier techno in like 98 to like 2002, that kind of period of loopy techno that went on, like Adam Beyer and Ben Sims and Gaytech and man, it was uh, Ignition Technician, Glenn Wilson, those kind of like pounding beats and pounding grooves and stuff like that. There was so many producers in that time that unfortunately they didn't. A lot of those techno producers didn't make it out of that period because loopy techno became not so popular. But there was some really strong producers in there. I still have better thoughts about a lot of those times. But Surgeon never really uh, got really tied into the loop, kind of the loop stuff. Although there were some tracks he did like Waiting on Me, and some of the counterbalance tracks he did, if you know Surgeon's back catalog well, some of those were kind of loopier style. So he kind of was brought into that, I suppose. But you can hear with the sound and his evolution out of that he didn't necessarily get tied into those, and still had a strong career after. But a lot of those producers didn't make it out of that time, unfortunately. But there's still a lot of I still really like a lot of the techno in there. I just like the more Kari Lekabush and James Ruskin and some of the more darker stuff in there. And also Surgeon's another one in there. But yeah, Empty Cloud sort of reminded me of that, gave me flashbacks of that period. But I still think it's a good track. I give it 6 stars. And then probably one of the most interesting tracks is the one that ends the album, which is called Fall. Really, probably the only melody in the album. It's a powerful track, heavy track, really cool rhythm as well. I gave that one 7.5 stars. I thought it was a really good track. But overall, just a alien sounding sci-fi album. Not to the point where it's super like verging on trance, alien sounding, like very sci-fi, but it definitely has like a very tribal and some sci-fi sounds in there. But obviously, with Surgeon, one thing you're going to get is great production. A lot of depth with the sounds, and they rise and fall, and just nice pace on the tracks, very powerful. You get what you expect with Surgeon. Well produced subterranean techno. Not much melody. He's more into the patterns and sort of melodic tones and the percussion and how those sounds kind of evolve. And that's great too. And he delivers with this album. Overall, I give it a 72 out of 100, right on the low side of very good. There's a couple excellent tracks in here, though. I mean, I rated 3 tracks over an 8. out of the nine. Or if you take away the interlude, there's really eight tracks, and I gave three, over an eight. Some nasty rhythms in here, some sick grooves in here, and there's also I gave two tracks over a seven. So there's some good music in here for sure. I would definitely recommend this album. I don't, to Surgeon fans. I don't, and maybe to newer techno fans or veteran techno fans. Anybody who knows Surgeon's gonna know what they get with this. But I would I would recommend a few of these tracks to some newer techno art fans of techno that are want to hear how you know 90s techno producer who came up through the 90s can make powerful techno. Because I do think one thing that's important to note about this track, and it's interesting because there's a track that sort of does it, and then a lot of tracks that don't and do it the proper way, in my opinion. The track called Serpent Void, for example, is the track I'm sort of speaking about. There's it's still a good track, and don't get me wrong, there's some great sounds on here, but there's some sort of peaks and valleys where a lot of techno tracks these days and sort of they have these builds and then they drops, and they're sort of carried by the builds and drops, and they sort of build up to that so much that where that becomes the focus. And I got a little bit of that on Serpent Void, and I was kind of a little bit like, these are kind of the well produced, but still an example of a track that sort of has the sort of typical new techno builds and drops. And I think that's kind of unexciting. And still, even though this track is able to come out of that, you see these other tracks on here, and the builds are done with the rhythm. They're, in my opinion, they're done the proper way, and the way they ebb and flow and sort of rise and fall, like it's a subliminal way to create a build and a drop and the ups and downs and waves of techno, like for Forgotten Gods, Divine Shadow, and even Triple Threat. Those are the ways in my and also Infinite Eye, like those are the ways to, in my opinion, properly build and have techno tracks flow. Like there's nothing like too obvious that builds up and then like there's some kind of drop. Like that seems so fake to me. I just like if you go up through the 90s and how trance sort of and some parts of techno kind of killed those styles in my opinion is because they were just really overly done, and I guess it sort of like came out of like the rave sort of warehouse where like it seemed to got a lot of attention, and these build-ups would happen and everybody would sort of clap and get all excited, and then there'd be like a cool melodic drop or a cool beat drop or something like that, and it became to the point where it was kind of like so cheesy. Like I never wanted to hear like a build-up or a drop again. And for some reason that's carried on still through the 2000s and even into the newer style of techno, and thankfully Surgeon brought it back to where it should be. And this that's what I would point out about this album is if there's you got some great tracks, you got some great production, but it's a proper way some of these tracks in how to build the tension in a techno track, which I think is so important. Like there's so many moods in deep listening that you can have with techno, and it can be very emotional. And when you hear a track that's very well done, like Forgotten Gods or Dying Shadow or Infinite Eye or even Fall, which those are my four favorite tracks, those are great examples of how you build tension in techno, in my opinion. And hats off to Surgeon for carrying that on. Just an excellent producer. Um, but yeah, I give the track, the overall album, a 72 out of 100. Definitely think it's a very good track. But yeah, check it out. It'll be coming out next week. You can definitely listen to it and purchase it on his Bandcamp page and other great retailers that support techno music. All right, so thanks for your time, and hopefully you enjoyed some of the tracks here. And definitely check out some more of Surgeon's music if you like what you hear here over the years. One of my favorite tracks of all time called Atoll. It's called ATOL. That track, man, that was like my that's like one of my examples of warehouse techno. in 1995. That track is so killer. But yeah, thanks for watching and your support on the channel, and I appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next video.
Electric Cafe.